She stood at the edge of the diner's counter clutching a worn handbag, like it was the last thing anchoring her to dignity. Her shoulders hunched not from weakness but from the practiced humility of a woman who had learned how the world looks at hunger, especially when it wears a mother's face. The smell of grilled meat and fresh bread twisted her stomach into knots as her eyes flicked toward the laminated menu she already knew she couldn't afford. Not today, not with her husband gone and 3 children waiting, at home with empty plates and hopeful lies. When she finally spoke, her voice barely carried over the clatter of dishes, just a simple request, almost an apology in itself, asking if there was anything left over, anything unsold, anything she could take home for her kids, promising she'd pay when she could, promising she wasn't trying to steal, promising everything except the one thing she shouldn't have had to promise at all, her humanity. The manager looked up slowly, annoyance already carved into his face like it lived there rent-free, his eyes sweeping her from worn shoes to tired, eyes as if measuring her worth in silence. And when he laughed, it wasn't loud, but sharp, the kind of laugh that cuts deeper than shouting. He accused her of begging, of scamming, of trying to get something for nothing, his voice rising so customers could hear, so shame could do the work his hands hadn't yet. She tried to explain, tears threatening but not falling because she couldn't afford even that. But he stepped closer, too close, jabbing a finger into her shoulder hard enough to make her stumble, telling her to get out before he called the police, before he made an example of her, before she learned what happens to people like her when she didn't move fast enough, when desperation slowed her legs. He grabbed her arm and shoved her toward the door. And that's when the room went quiet, because outside, the low thunder of engines rolled across the parking lot like a warning the manager didn't recognize. One by one, motorcycles pulled in, heavy machines gleaming under the sun, leather-clad riders dismounting with calm precision, their presence commanding attention without a word. And as the door swung open and the woman stumbled out, nearly falling to the pavement, one of the bikers caught her before she hit the ground. The manager froze in the doorway, still puffed up with power, still convinced he was right, never noticing how the air had shifted, never seeing how the men he'd ignored moments earlier had watched everything through the diner's front window, never realizing that kindness, once crossed, has a way of summoning consequences. If this story already has your heart racing, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because what happens next will remind you that justice doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it rides on 2 wheels. The biker who steadied her spoke gently, asking if she was hurt. And when she shook her head with quiet embarrassment, another rider removed his jacket and draped it over her shoulders, not as charity but as respect, while the rest of the group turned toward the diner in unison, their boots hitting the pavement with deliberate calm that made the manager's bravado crumble into panic. He tried to speak first, tried to justify himself with rules and policies and excuses that sounded hollow the moment they left his mouth. But the lead rider stepped forward, eyes steady, voice low, asking a single question that cut through every excuse. "Why did you put your hands on her?" The manager stammered, backing away, suddenly aware of how alone he was, how the customers inside now watched him the way he had watched her. Judging, silent, unkind. The bikers didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't need to. They simply demanded accountability, reminding him that food wasted is a crime when children are hungry, that power abused is still abuse, that decency isn't optional just because someone is poor. One rider filmed everything. Another called the owner of the diner, and another quietly placed an order, every meal on the menu paid in full, to be boxed and delivered to the woman's home, not as pity but as a statement. When the owner arrived, red-faced and furious, the truth unraveled fast, and the manager's job went with it, right there on the spot, his authority stripped as easily as he'd tried to strip her dignity. The bikers walked her to her door later that evening, helping carry food inside as her children stared wide-eyed, not at the leather vests or roaring bikes, but at the kindness that filled their kitchen like warmth. Before they left, the lead rider knelt to the children's level, and told them something simple, that their mother was brave, that asking for help is not weakness, and that the world is still full of people who show up when it matters. As engines faded into the distance, the woman stood in her doorway holding back tears, not of shame this time, but of relief, because she'd learned that day that cruelty may speak loudly, but compassion answers louder when given the chance. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that standing up for others still matters, subscribe to the channel now, because these are the stories the world needs more of, and together we make sure they're never forgotten. The air outside the diner had completely changed. The same woman who moments earlier stood trembling under humiliation, now protected within a quiet circle of bikers, her hands still shaking, but her eyes no longer filled with fear, only disbelief and gratitude, while the manager, who had felt powerful seconds ago, stood frozen in the doorway, his voice gone because the silence of the leather-clad riders was heavier than shouting. The leader stepped forward and asked just one question, calm and deadly honest: if this were your mother, would you have treated her the same way? And in that moment, every excuse collapsed. Phones were already recording, truth was being preserved, and a call had been placed to the restaurant owner, who arrived to see the full picture laid bare. A mother asking for food for her children, and a man who chose cruelty over compassion. The decision was immediate. The manager's job ended on the spot. Apologies no longer enough. And then the bikers did something unexpected. They placed an order for every meal on the menu, paid in full, and packed it carefully to be taken home. When the woman reached her house later that evening, her children stood at the door, their eyes lighting up not just at the food, but at the hope it represented. Because this was more than dinner, it was dignity returned.